Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much to my hosts, and we are really so delighted to get to learn from you this evening, Dr. Baumgarten. It is my great honor to introduce Elisheva Baumgarten, this year's Distinguished Henry Diller Annual Lecturer, for her talk titled, it's up here, Shared Appeals to Different Gods, Jews, Christians, and Medieval Prayer. It is a true honor to introduce Dr. Baumgarten, whose work arguably has determined the contours of all current historical investigations into medieval Jewish life. We are in for a treat tonight because Dr. Baumgarten's talk inhabits the center of the field of study to which she has given shape, the study of medieval European Jewish life, as it indicates both Jewish social differentiation from the broader Christian environment, as well as Jewish participation in and assimilation of the Christian culture within which it operated. Perhaps most striking in Dr. Baumgarten's scholarship is her mastery of classical rabbinic texts, medieval rabbinic developments, along with archival materials. In each of her works, time and again, she summons classical rabbinic texts, traditional Jewish liturgy, poetry, tombstone epitaphs, inscriptions, architecture, illuminated manuscripts, and the genres of Jewish writings, custom books, Talmudic commentaries, responsa literature, communal records. All of this familiarity and deep access enables Elisheva to take up the task that historian Jacob Katz articulated around 80 years ago in his classic work, Exclusiveness and Tolerance. In that volume, in its introductory pages, Jacob Katz recognizes that one cannot read classical rabbinic sources, or even biblical ones for that matter, and assume that they themselves dictated the course of Jewish actions and social life. Instead, charged Katz, the historian of the Jews must ascertain, and here I'm quoting, which parts of the tradition retained their historical force, and which parts were neutralized and treated as dead letter. In my eyes, Dr. Baumgarten is the master of this discernment. Full access and deep knowledge of classical rabbinic renderings, but always with an eye towards these materials as they emerged from the conditions of life in the fullest sense. In her hands, Jewish materials are not treated as fixed or closed entities, that would be Katz's sense of a dead letter, but as part of a social life. The recitation of prayers, tonight's topic, synagogue life, these are not rarefied, top-down, fixed, and determined activities, but they are expressions of a living social reality. If you will permit me a metaphor, Dr. Baumgarten handles Jewish sources a bit like somebody tuning a string instrument. Perhaps it's a harp or a piano, and the tuner leans into the string and listens to its sounds to assess which strings remain taut and which ones have gone slack, which notes are best understood in relation to the context in which they are sounded, and which are drawing from the instrument itself. I trust that tonight Dr. Baumgarten will invite us into this process of attunement and help us to ascertain the many factors that supplied the words of medieval Jewish prayers. Without listing her many publications and tiring you, I will skip my final page and invite Dr. Baumgarten for the lecture. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dina, for that beautiful introduction. I hope I live up to some of it. Thank you to everyone here at Berkeley for inviting me. First of all, to Professor Duncan McRae, who reached out a number of months ago with this lovely invitation. I was honored and privileged to come. To all my colleagues here who've made me feel so welcome, to Jennifer Liscombe and to Etta Heber, who've made sure that my trip here has been so smooth, and to all of you who've come here tonight to hear me. I'm very grateful to all of you. So let us begin. In the late 13th century, Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, a northern French rabbi known for his biblical commentaries, wrote a letter to his colleague, Rabbi Eliakim, and issued a fierce warning against women and people who went to pilgrimage to different graves. He wrote, "May God grant peace to my beloved Rabbi Eliakim. It should be known that I am astounded by people who make vows to go to the cemetery because it is a little similar to seeking the dead." Reading his responsum, it becomes evident that Chaim Paltiel knows many will object to his approach. Yet after some halachic discussion, he continues. But women and men who do not know, I do not know why they go there to the cemetery. He concludes by explaining that he counsels such people, women and men who do not know, who take upon themselves vows to go to cemeteries, that they should give charity to redeem themselves from their vows. They should give as much money as going on a trip to a cemetery would have cost them. And in this way, they should not go on such trips. What exactly was Rabbi Chaim Paltiel opposing? Why was this practice so offensive in his eyes? I suggest to you that he was unhappy about the prayers that were being said in the cemetery, prayers to the dead, because he saw them as a form of seeking the dead. This is, of course, a biblical interdiction, as we see in the book of Deuteronomy. But it was also a part of medieval reality. Making this accusation in Christian Europe, Rabbi Paltiel is worried that his congregants are behaving like Christians, who often prayed to the dead and made pilgrimages to different tomb sites to issue these prayers. His responsum also suggests that the danger of praying to the dead was especially great when practiced by women and men who do not know. Nashim uvnei adam she'enam yod'im. My talk tonight will focus on two prayers. The first one is a prayer that I think these women and men who did not know could have said in a cemetery. The second is a prayer to ward off fever. As you will see, these prayers were not so easy for me to find. So part of what I will do tonight is present them to you. I'm very pleased to have found them. I will also be arguing that they are either very similar to or actual adaptations of Christian prayers. So one question that I will ask is, what were the mechanisms of filtration and negotiation between Jewish and Christian culture? How did Jews come about to say these prayers that were similar to the ones Christians were saying? A second issue that will interest me is the place of the rabbis, such as Rabbi Paltiel and his friend, Rabbi Eliakim, to whom he was writing this letter, who are the standard heroes of many studies in medieval Jewish history, and the women and the men who do not know, who are really the heroes of the studies that I've written over the years. So those are really the two big questions behind the talk tonight. In order to take you on this journey with me, my talk will have 4 parts. First, I will provide a little bit of background about the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz, so that those of you who are not medievalists will be situated in time and place. Then I will explore the 2 prayers. The first is the graveside prayer that I will suggest that our women and men who do not know were saying. And the second is a prayer that Jews said when a family member of theirs had a high fever. In conclusion, I will situate these prayers in a more general framework of my recent and ongoing work, underlining what I see as important directions for future research. So I'm already warning you, I won't give you an answer. I'll probably be leaving with you with a few more questions at the end. So for the background. The sources I will discuss tonight were all written in medieval Ashkenaz, broadly defined as Germany and northern France. Tonight I will be focusing on the 13th and 14th century, and most of my sources will be from northern France. The Jews, at least those for whom we have multiple sources, were first and foremost urban Jews who lived in the burgeoning towns and cities of medieval Europe during a period of tremendous economic and cultural development. This was a situation that changed profoundly during the 14th century due to recurrent crises. They felt at home within their localities despite ongoing and recurring tensions between Jews and Christians. And this picture here, which I adore, from the Worms Machzor, shows you how at home the Jews felt within their towns when drawing a sha'ar, a gate, for the high holiday liturgy. They drew something that really looked like a medieval town, although you will notice they didn't draw a medieval church. They just drew a lot of different medieval buildings. The Jews in these towns lived most often in specific neighborhoods, where most or all of the Jews lived together. But even in these cases where there was a Rue de Juif or a Judengasse, these were not exclusively Jewish spaces, and they were located in the heart of the urban spaces. My point of departure in my research, which is by no means uniquely mine, and is the accepted approach over the past decades in the field, is that these Jews were simultaneously embedded in medieval society and a distinct minority within it. The question of how these two aspects of their identities work simultaneously is one of the challenges of the last decades of scholarship. Scholars in the second half of the 20th century who recognized that ideas previously understood as either Jewish or Christian were in fact shared, have focused on texts, including the Bible, exegesis, and polemic writings, underlined differences and heightened similarities, and above all, sought a smoking gun that would prove that specific Jews and Christians had means of communication. This work was carried out, at least in Israel and to some extent in North America, first and foremost by historians who were interested in the history of ideas, and by extension, in those who formulated the ideas. With regards to medieval Ashkenaz, this usually means the rabbinic scholars who left us the written record. In my work, there are three shifted emphases that will be evident in my presentation tonight. The first is that the people I am seeking to address are not the learned members of the community, or not just the learned members of the communities, but all members of the medieval Jewish communities, and we already have met one expression of this in my first source. An underlying assumption that is worthy of further discussion, and I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but that will be evident throughout the talk, is that I am not searching for a smoking gun, but rather I am assuming shared ideas. I am assuming constant communication between Jews and Christians. And put differently, whereas previous generations of scholars may have spent their energy asking if and how one text moved from the members of one religion to another, I am asking how the text will take me to the people. I'll expand on this at the end of my talk, but I wanted to put this out there now so you would have it in mind as I discuss these prayers. So let us move to the first part of the talk, the graveside prayers. Returning to Rabbi Paltiel, let us situate the practice he is describing, men and women praying in cemeteries. Cemeteries in medieval Jewish communities were a feature of most of the larger ones. One of the institutions medieval Jews negotiated for when obtaining privileges that allowed them to live in different locations was the right to a cemetery. You can see it here in this charter from 1084. I emphasized it in blue. When the Bishop of Speyer gave Jews the right to live in the city of Speyer, he states, besides this, I have given them land of the church for a cemetery with rights of inheritance. Unlike Christian cemeteries that were usually located in churchyards, Jews buried their dead outside the city walls, although in some cases, these locations became part of the city boundaries as it grew. Here you can see medieval Speyer. The central circle over there is where the Jews lived. You can see it says synagogue and mikveh, if you can see those little letters there. But the cemetery was outside the town. You can see it outside the walls of the city. Medieval sources, Hebrew and Latin, discuss processions to Jewish cemeteries as everyday occurrences. To give just a few examples, medieval Jews went to the cemetery on holiday eves, on specific holidays such as Tisha B'Av, on their loved ones' yard sites, the days of their death. That's another medieval custom. We all think Jews always had yard sites, but as the German word tells you, that is a medieval Ashkenazic custom. And when they wanted to pray. The cemetery was an important communal institution. And if we look at this map of medieval Worms, just to give you another example, so you can see the Jewish quarter up there on the right, but you can also see the cemetery outside the walls of the city, you can see that their processions to the cemetery were very obvious because you had to walk through the whole city in order to get there. So people always saw Jews going back and forth from the cemetery. The cemetery was also an important communal space to be supported by the different members of the community. From Nuremberg in the late 13th century, we have the Nuremberg Memorbuch that records the donations of different members of the community. I just chose a random page, and please believe me, I just pulled out a random page. If you have a look at this little square here, look at how many times the cemetery is mentioned as a place being given donations to. You can see the word Bet Kfarot, for those of you who read Hebrew, again and again and again in every one of the donations. Tombstones in some cemeteries single out community members who dedicated their lives to building cemeteries and upkeeping them. And local Christian authorities often pledged and repledged their commitment to protecting the Jewish cemeteries under their authority. As recent research has shown, the dead were an important component of medieval Jewish communal life. For this reason, it comes as a little surprise that Jews would pray by the graves of their loved one. But the challenge, at least for me, has been to figure out what they were saying when they were praying by these gravestones. We have very few medieval Sidurim, daily prayer books, most probably because medieval Jews who frequented the synagogue 3 times a day would have known the daily prayers by heart, and also because daily books would have also suffered daily wear and tear, so they did not survive. So one of my big challenges has been to try to find a prayer someone could have said by a grave. The graveside prayer I finally found, in fact, does not appear in a Siddur, so of course I found it by chance. I noted before that Jews went to the cemetery on holidays and before holidays. Holidays and other calendric issues were often recorded and discussed in books called Sifrei Ibur, books my colleague Elisheva Baumgarten has explored in her work on time. One such book, found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France today, manuscript Hebrew 1032, was written in northern France shortly before the Great Expulsion of 1306. The prayer I found is almost an afterthought. It appears on the last leaf of the manuscript in the same hand as the rest of the manuscript, and it reads, "May it be the will before you, King of kings, Melech Malchem Lachim, that you will have mercy on Israel and on me, and give me a good life, and forgive my sins in this world, and grant me a good part in Eden, because of the merit of the righteous person buried here. And make me rejoice when the Messiah comes, and the souls of the dead are restored, because of the merit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Save me from all trouble, because of the merit of Moses, David, and Rabbi Akiva and his friends, and don't reject my plea, and because of the merit of all the dead and all the holy, hear my prayers on this grave, like you heard the prayers of our fathers on the Red Sea, with mercy and goodwill. Blessed are you, God, Baruch Atah Hashem, who hears prayers." Reading this prayer, reciting it in Hebrew, it seems at first glance very Jewish. It is formulated as a standard blessing, ending with Baruch Atah Hashem. It seeks a good place in the Garden of Eden. It mentions the Messiah and the end of days, calling on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, David, and Rabbi Akiva, and asks God to hear the prayers like those of the Jews when crossing the Red Sea. Yet it also prays to the dead, something that we just saw before Jews were not supposed to do, something that Christians in the medieval world were known to do. If I were to put on medieval Christian glasses for a moment, the prayer could pass for a Christian one with, of course alterations. Instead of talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we could talk about Jesus and Mary. Instead of calling on Moses, David, and Rabbi Akiva, we could call on different saints. It is, in fact, one of the most common and earliest forms of Christian prayers to ask God to hear the prayer like he heard Daniel in the furnace, the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, etc. And praying to all the dead and the Kedoshim, the saints, was an ongoing feature of medieval Christian life. So perhaps some of Rabbi Paltiel's fears are not unwarranted. Maybe these Jews praying to the dead were doing something that was very much like their Christian neighbors. We know that Jews were well aware of Christian saints. Saints were constant features of medieval Christian life. And if you look at this picture here, which I will not explain right now, but which I have written on at length, what you see here is a Christian calendar in Hebrew letters with the names of many different saints that the Jews were familiar with. Medieval Christians went on pilgrimages to saints' tombs, but also prayed to the dead, family members, and saints in their homes, their churches, their places of business and learning, including universities. The Mass for the dead, a constant feature of medieval life, was of great social, religious, and cultural importance. Prayers for the dead were often said in the vernacular rather than in Latin. Megan McLaughlin, who wrote about the prayers for the dead, explained that these were simple prayers, easy to remember and easy to understand, and they turned to biblical heroes and saints, asking them to protect the living. Virginia Reinsberg has recently outlined the structure of these prayers, stating, colloquy-style prayers are relatively formal exchanges with God, Mary, or a saint. They are like conversations one would have had with a lord, magistrate, or master. They resemble audiences, a similarity reinforced by the request expressed in one prayer, and here she gives an example, Lord, give me a hearing. They begin with an invocation and sometimes a request to be heard, followed by a request for assistance. Often the prayer includes an argument in which the devotee presents a case for why God or the saint should grant a request. In the invocation, the devotee calls upon the person to whom the prayer is addressed, Lord God, Holy Mother of God, Madame Saint Martha, and so on. The devotee then makes a request, usually followed by a promise, to devote self or life to God or the saint. If we skip back just for a moment, what I just read would fit this prayer quite well. So is this a Jewish prayer or a Christian one? To be fair, there is a Jewish precedent for prayers like these. Already in the Mishnah, in Tractate Ta'anit, we read, for the first he says, he who answered Abraham on Mount Moriah, he shall answer you and hear the voice of your cry on this day. Blessed are you, Lord, who redeems Israel. For the second he shall say, etc. He who answered our fathers at the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea, he shall answer you and hear the voice of your cry on this day, etc. What I am trying to say is that while this practice of praying by the graveside may resemble contemporaneous Christian practice, it also had Jewish roots and Jewish precedents. This complicates our attempts to distinguish between religious traditions and who this custom actually belongs to. So if I go back to Chaim Paltiel, what exactly was he opposing? It seems that for Paltiel, these prayers transgressed a line, visible or invisible, between what Jews did and what Christians did. It also seems that for him, when women and people who did not know prayed prayers like this, they would more easily cross that line than maybe somebody learned who knew how to distinguish between what was Jewish and what was Christian. What Rabbi Paltiel seems to be suggesting is that you can go to the place where a person is buried, but you can't pray to the dead person. But when women and people who do not know go to places such as this, they do not know how to distinguish between the place and the person they are praying to. And the prayer we read shows that very clearly, because they are praying to the dead, to the person buried there, and to all the holy and the sainted. So I'm going to leave this prayer and go on to my second prayer, and then we'll see what we do with them. So now let us move to my second example, the prayer against fever. Probably at around the same time that my anonymous copyist copied his calendric materials book and had this last fly of the beautiful prayer I just showed you, another Jew in northern France named Isaac, son of Isaac from Chinon, who lived on the Loire River, copied a Siddur. This is what it looks like. It's a very tiny book on very, very thin paper. Isaac is a known Tosaphist, and while he was not of the stature of Chaim Paltiel, he was a learned man. His Siddur was not just a prayer book. It became a kind of personal notebook with lots of addenda related to different matters. On one of the folia, Isaac transcribed a number of prayers against fever, an everyday occurrence. Some of them are in Hebrew, but some of them are in French in Hebrew letters. Menachem Banit has already copied the prayer in French a number of years ago, and he called it a French conjuration against fever, recorded in Hebrew letters. I also want to acknowledge the work of my student, Amit Shafran, who analyzed some elements of this prayer in her MA thesis. Amit was interested in magical elements in the conjuration, and she noted that this prayer, which sought to conjure God to make the fever leave its victim, was dissimilar to most Jewish prayers. Here you can have a look at what the prayer looks like in Hebrew, and you can see its translation in modern French, thanks to what Banit did. You can see that the prayer starts with two Hebrew words, refuah shlema. In French, you can see that, for a complete recovery, for a complete healing. And Rabbi Isaac ben Isaac, at the very end of the prayer, added a few other Hebrew words, and it says there, v'yo'il be'ezrat Hashem, and it should work, please God. Let us have a look at what this conjuration or prayer actually says. And I'm going to read it in English rather than take you through the French and Hebrew letters and the French translation. So for good health, l'refuah shlema, I conjure you, bon malon, or the fever, or the carbuncle, by the Lord God, who neither should or does disappoint, who neither sleeps nor slumbers. I conjure you by God, the mighty King, since you are here, that you no longer progress. I conjure you by God the great, since you are here, not to profit anymore. I conjure you by God who is in heaven, since you are here, not to remain in my body anymore. I conjure you by the Lord God, take away your cruelty, and by bread and salt, by wine and water, and by all that God has created. I conjure you by the living God, and by the true health who inspires the doctor, and by bread and wine, and by all that God created, not to stay here. I conjure you by all the prayers that exist and have never existed. I conjure you with all the prayers that have been, and all those that will see the light of day. I conjure you by all the holy men who ever came into the world, and by Abraham the great man, who was ready to sacrifice his son for the love of God, and to make him suffer martyrdom, and actually heal in the same way. That's a very Jewish way of understanding the sacrifice of Isaac in the Middle Ages. One that God restored to the prophetess Miriam after she had leprosy and actually healed. Drive out this evil from here and relieve this pain, so be it from all to eternity. This is the prayer that Rabbi Isaac ben Isaac copied to conjure the fever from people's body. As you can see here, this prayer is quite unusual. Following Banit Shafran, my student, saw this prayer as a magical formula, especially in light of the conjuration it contains. However, in contrast both to Banit and to Shafran, I would argue that magic and exorcism are not the right definitions of what is happening here. Prayer played a very large role in medieval medicine, and entreating God, angels, and holy figures to intercede on behalf of the sufferer was quite standard in both Judaism and Christianity. After Amit completed her work, and she actually went to work in high tech, something a lot of Israelis seem to do today, I was preparing a class, and I came across a prayer which I believe was the basis for this conjuration. The prayer I found is from the 6th century, and it is part of a mass dedicated to the Burgundian king Sigismund, who was believed after his death to have the power to cure people of fevers, and some suggest specifically of malaria. Gregory of Tours reports that whenever people suffering from chills piously celebrate a mass in his honor and make an offering to God for the king's repose, immediately their tremors cease, their fevers disappear, and they are restored to their earlier health. Prayers related to Sigismund that sought to ameliorate fever can be found in Latin and in the vernacular throughout the Middle Ages, starting in the 7th century in the Bobbio Missal, and appearing in many different forms. Here, for example, is a 14th century French example. Some versions are short, simply asking the fever to leave the body of the sufferer, whereas others are longer. Praying to Sigismund to cure fevers was a popular practice, and the prayer appears in numerous books of hours and other collections, as Saint Sigismund was celebrated throughout Europe on May 1st. If we look at this version that appears in a 14th century manuscript from Dijon, we will see the following. For the commemoration of Saint Sigismund, King, for your servant, Lord God, in the name of the Father, I speak to you, O fevers. In the name of the Son, I speak against you. In the name of the Holy Spirit, I conjure you, O fevers. You are 7 sisters. And it goes on with a long, long description of who is represented here. I conjure you and join issue with you by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Trinity, and by St. Mary, St. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, who is called the medicine of God, holy angels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, by those powers which contain heaven and earth, and by St. John the Baptist, who baptized the Lord God in the river Jordan. I conjure you, fevers, and join issue with you, that you be cast out of the servant of God. Amen, 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 our Father. And the manuscript ends, in the memory of the Holy King Sigismund, Lord God, free the servant, so-and-so. In the name of the Father, I say to your fevers, in the name of the Son, I contradict you. In the name of the Holy Spirit, I conjure you. Let us go back to the Hebrew prayer for a moment. If we compare between them, we can see some similarities and many differences. But if a Jew knew this prayer was useful and heard his neighbor saying this prayer, whether in Latin or probably in medieval French, perhaps a Jew could replace those very issues that were difficult for him as a Jew with matters that made more sense to him. And we can see this here very nicely. If you compare between this paragraph over here and the Hebrew paragraph, you can see on the right. Perhaps Jews were adapting and adopting something they thought that worked. And Rabbi Isaac ben Isaac, a learned man, seems to have had no trouble doing this in his book. So how did Jews come to know this prayer? I assume that French Jews heard their neighbors reciting this prayer over their sick children. Their neighbors were probably reciting it in the vernacular rather than in the Latin. And the prayer, as I've just suggested to you, was appealing enough to make the jump to the Jewish community, where it was put to work curing Jews suffering from fever. Isaac ben Isaac of Chinon thought it worth recording in his manuscript alongside other Hebrew prayers for the sick. But what is the mechanism at work here? Did Jews remove the holy names, leave the material culture, which I can talk about maybe in the Q&A, the bread and the water and the salt that we saw before, replace Christian examples with Jewish ones so that this prayer, originally a mass, can be transformed into a prayer for Jewish people suffering from fever? Did the Jews choose this prayer because it was associated with a Christian king rather than an actual saint? Did that make any difference in the High Middle Ages, talking about a figure from the 6th century? Were certain Christian figures more offensive than others? Mary and Miriam are often paralleled, and we can see this here. But were other shared figures, such as Raphael or Gabriel, lost in translation? No less fascinating is the vehicle through which we hear of this prayer. Isaac was a learned man. Was he uncomfortable with his appropriation of this prayer? Was he able to do it because he was learned? And if women and men who did not know, if they were to do something like this, would be scorned? Should we interpret the way he framed the prayer, starting with Lirfu'ah Shlema and ending with V'yo'il Be'ezrat Hashem, and it should do good, please God, as an indication that he knew he was doing something extraordinary? Or perhaps he's writing this down because this is what he really believes. This is a prayer, Lirfu'ah Shlema, for good health. And if you say it, it will help the person who's sick with God's help. Banit remarked apologetically that with his opening and final words in Hebrew, he returned to his rabbinic prestige. But I would argue that this might not be the case. The prayer was part of Isaac's repertoire, no more or less than other prayers that are more traditional. While few Jews would pray to Jesus, dead or resurrected, they would direct their prayers to the more appropriate figures of Abraham and Miriam. And as this example shows, Jews were, it seems, comfortable conjuring God to cure fevers. Dismissing this as magic reduces the everyday activities of Jews in a way that does not give medieval people credit for their own actions or understandings. So here you have my 2 prayers. One of them we can see more comfortably as a Jewish prayer with Jewish precedents. The other one clearly without the Jewish precedents, but we can see how a Christian prayer was Judaized. One of them was forbidden by a rabbi. The other one was recorded by a rabbi. So what do we do with these examples? So what I want to do now is leave my specific examples and turn to some more general thoughts about prayer, and more specifically about scholarship on Jewish life in medieval Christian Europe and these matters. Personal devotion was important for medieval people, whether Jews or Christians, as exemplified, for instance, by the popularity of books of hours in Christian culture. Books of hours were books used by Christians for their individual prayers every day. And indeed, the Mass of St. Sigismund, this prayer that I was talking about, appears in many books of hours. In Jewish studies, research has tended to focus on the community and on the communal prayer rather than on individual prayers, despite the fact that from antiquity, Jewish everyday practice has included multiple rituals performed alone by individuals throughout the day. Such prayers accompanied everyday practices and occurrences. And I'm not just talking about the blessings that everyone said along with their daily ritual, but also about prayers people actually said. I recently read, or perhaps more accurately I should say, I reread an old article by my teacher, Professor Israel Tashma, may he rest in peace, in which Tashma wrote that perhaps half of the prayers from medieval Ashkenaz were private prayers of the sort we saw today. But Tashma, in his usual Tashma fashion, says, we don't have most of them, so I can't say anything about them. I don't know if Tashma is right that more than half the prayers in medieval Ashkenaz were private prayers of this sort. But whether it was half the prayers, or a third of the prayers, or a quarter of the prayers, or even just 1/10 of the prayers, I think these two manuscripts I've shown you are indications that there were many prayers like this that haven't survived and haven't reached us. Illness was a prime example for such prayers, as medieval people usually treated illness with a combination of medicine and prayers. Doctors and healers used herbs and treatments, but they often recommended prayers and other formula, or simply prayed for the sick themselves as part of their curative practices. So too, when seeking cures, people often utilized known prayers or those devised for specific purposes. Prayer and illness are most often studied by scholars by focusing on the learned practitioners, the rabbis or the churchmen who wrote the prayer books or the prayers, and the doctors and healers who prescribed the cures. However, in my recent research project, together with my students, we have tried to look at the everyday lives of medieval Jews, privileging their experiences over traumatic singular events that have often been the focus of study, and seeking those who are not necessarily learned or knowledgeable. We have called this project Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe. So the daily part is to say that in order to understand Jews in the past, it's not enough just to say, this event happened or that event happened, the First Crusade, the Black Death, you can choose any event you want. But really we have to understand their lives as an ongoing, repetitive phenomena and understand what they did day in, day out. No less interesting to me is the name I have called these people by. I have called them beyond the elite. Perhaps another way to call them would be women and men who do not know, which we saw at the beginning of my formulation tonight, but that doesn't work so well when you're writing a grant. But it also doesn't work so well when you're trying to define a group of people you don't know quite how to define. So why have we said beyond the elite? If I have to condense our impetus over the past several years into one sentence, I would say that our goal has been to move from the texts themselves to the people behind them or among whom they were written. Since most of the texts that have reached us were written by elites, learned and or financial and political, it's very hard to know who wasn't part of the elite. So what we've tried to do is to get to this group, this so-called silent majority, and knowing that it's very hard to reach them because they didn't leave written records, we phrased our goal as beyond the elite. It's also a desideratum and also a challenge. So although the texts of the elite are inevitably always part of the source base I work with, we have worked to consistently avoid going top-down and sought a bottom-up approach wherever was possible. How did we do this? We did this in two ways that I would like to talk about. The first way is by situating every case we talked about within 4 prisms. These were the 4 prisms of our studies: ritual, space, objects, and people. If you take, for example, the first prayer I spoke about tonight, it's a ritual said by a graveside. So it's a ritual said at the cemetery to the dead. The space is the cemetery. Objects would be the prayer books people brought with them, maybe objects they put down by the tombstones or in the cemetery, and the question of who are the people who are practicing this. Every single daily occurrence can be understood within these 4 prisms. And we've tried to map out the way people live their lives using different places and spaces and approaches like this. Another key way we went about this was our approach to sources. And I hope I've shown you this a little bit tonight. Rather than working with just one genre of source, we've tried to work with multiple sources from a variety of genres to allow multiple intersections. And I tried to provide a small example of this tonight. This has also proved to be one of the advantages of working as a group. And here you can see my group on a trip in Germany some years ago. As each member brings their own subspecialty to bear in creating what has proven to be a rich and multivalent understanding of Jewish life during the medieval period. So one of the things we've really worked on doing is trying to have as many sources as possible talk to us to be able to map out what's going on. I just want to mention this here tonight, that we recently have published a source book exactly to show how we do that. The source book is free, downloadable. You can use it in all your classes and anything you want to do. And we also created an art exhibit with Israeli artists in which we taught them our sources and asked them to try to present what they understood from it. The exhibit was up in Jerusalem until this past fall, and now it's in Erfurt in Germany, and it will also be moving around to other places in Europe and even coming to the United States. So we've really experimented with this a lot. After 6 years of joint work, we have remained with a very big question with which we set out, and with which I began tonight. How can we better explore the mechanism of filtration and negotiation between the cultures that existed in medieval Europe? Even when we situate medieval Jews within their local spaces, next door to their Christian neighbors, adopting and adapting practice from them, what did they incorporate and what did they leave out? Can we identify consistent patterns, or was this a more random process? To some extent, and now that the project is officially over, I can actually say this, while one can say that the impetus was to go beyond the elite, we wanted to go beyond, in actuality, we ended up a return to being in between Jews and Christians, trying to understand what went on in between them. Prayer and medicine, prayer and death, both of which I discussed tonight in my examples, are excellent examples of in-betweenness. Medical knowledge was shared by Jews and Christians. It was a body of knowledge that also contained highly specific religious elements that gave pause to members of one religion when recommended to members of the other religion. Or did it? What does Rabbi Isaac show us? How does he make the transition from a Christian prayer to a Jewish prayer? Although members of both religions died, and many of their death rituals were similar, Jews and Christians alike believe that their deaths led them to completely separate spaces. The Jewish cemetery and the Christian cemetery, the Jewish dead and the Christian dead, both in practice and in the world to come, were believed by medieval people to be completely separate. Jews went to Jewish heaven, Christians went to Christian heaven. But did Jews say similar prayers by their dead's tombstones that Christians said by their dead tombstones? Prayers, too, are religious specific, perhaps the most religious specific of all. But sometimes they were not. Take, for example, the book of Psalms that was so central to Jewish and Christian daily worship in the medieval world. But then the sayer of the prayer defined its function. When a Jew said Psalms, it was different than when a Christian said Psalms. But sometimes saying the same prayer or similar prayers could serve members of both religions for similar purposes. So the cases I explored tonight are good examples of how complicated it is to try to understand what these mechanisms were, how one could take a prayer from one culture and use it in the other culture, and when one couldn't take a prayer from one culture and use it in the other culture. And very interestingly, in my eyes, we started with a rabbi who objected to Jews praying by graves because it seemed too Christian to him. And we ended with a rabbi who took a Christian prayer and made it usable by Jews. So I'm left with the question of how did Jews decide what to take or what not to take, what could be used and what not could be used. So I'm leaving you with a problem to be explored rather than an answer. I believe that this is an issue that many of you study Jews in other periods or contacts between cultures at large, not just Jewish cultures, deal with in your work, and I'm eager for your comments and insights and questions. In the case of medieval Ashkenazic Jews that I discussed tonight, and returning to the missive sent by Rabbi Chaim Paltiel to his colleague, I'll end with both a definitive statement and a question. My definitive statement is that I have no doubt that if we want to better understand the world of medieval Ashkenazic Jewry, we must include not only rabbis like Chaim Paltiel and his colleague, but also the women and the men who did not know. They will teach us a lot about what their life was like, what they believed in, and what those beliefs meant. But I am also ending with the question of how we should go about to better understand how they appropriated, incorporated, and opposed the practices that were part of the world they lived in, and how they explained to themselves the different ways in which they were both part of and different from the world of their neighbors. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I have a particular question, just my own understanding of the first prayer, okay, in the cemetery. Is the prayer directed towards God and asking to fulfill things on the merit of all the people that are mentioned, all the archetypes? Or are they actually praying to those saints? Are they praying to Moses? Are they praying to Abraham as Christians would pray to the saints? And it was not clear to me.
So I put the prayer back up there so you can see it as I speak.
I was thinking of the other one.
Oh, you're talking about the fever one.
No, but let's do this one too.
Oh, okay, fine. Yes.
Okay, so I think the wording here is very, very careful, but this wording could be kind of like a way around things. And in fact, one of my colleagues, who was in a previous version of the talk, but I was trying to make it fit into my time, Ephraim Shalom Steiner, he wrote an article that appeared in the Harvard Theological Review, and his article is called, "Because a prayer in that place will be most welcome." And he's working exactly on the assumption that you can pray in the place where someone is buried, but not to the person who is buried. If you look at this prayer, it is very, very clear that they say here, "B'zchut hatzadik hanikbar po," because of the merit of the righteous person buried here. So if you really wanted to be kind of very rabbinic, you would say he's not praying to the person, he's praying to his merit. And that's how you get around it, right? And then you see that again, b'zchut, right? Biglal ezrach nekad v'tam, right? Because of, not praying to them. B'zchut kol hametim v'kdoshim. To the merit of all these people. I mean, you could go that way and say that Jews were making that very kind of minute distinction. And then Paltiel is saying, women and people who don't know, they don't know how to make that fine distinction, which is why they can't say those prayers, and only important rabbis can say those prayers. But that to me makes the question even more complicated. Because what are you saying? If you're an important rabbi, you can pray like the Christians, because you know how to make that very kind of minute distinction. But if you're a simple woman, or a man who doesn't know, then you really shouldn't be doing that. I think that's a little bit too complicated, and I think it shows you how problematic this practice was on the one hand, and at the same time I want to make this point really clear. It shows you how popular the practice was. Everybody is doing this. People are going to the cemetery all the time and doing this. And I think what drives home the point, and this is something I'm not an expert at, is that if you look at the early modern prayers, you see that Jews do this all the time. The Tchinas in Yiddish, and the different prayers said in Yiddish, then it becomes okay. But in the medieval period, they're still kind of battling this and figuring it out. Then it becomes distinctly Jewish. I think the medieval period is a much more formative period in which these practices are forming, and that's why we have this pushback that we see here in this prayer. As far as the medical, the fever prayer, You know, I think that if we look here, I conjure you by all the holy men who ever came into the world, and by Abraham, the great man who was ready to sacrifice his son, etc., etc. I think they are praying to Abraham here. But what does it mean, I conjure you? I mean, this is a different kind of expression. So yes, if we wanted to be very rabbinic and really Tosafist, we would say there's a little distinction here. I tend to think that this distinction is very, very minute, and that the Jews here are doing something very, very similar to their neighbors. And maybe they would have said exactly what you're saying. And I've written about this, kind of about, it's the narcissism of small differences in a different way. But this kind of small differences that make a difference to the Jews and the Christians. And they would say very clearly, I'm different because I'm doing this differently. I wonder if for us as historians, we can see those differences so well and what kind of sensitivities we need. And that's part of what I'm trying to get at as well. So you're touching on something that interests me very much, but I'm also pushing back against it a little bit.
I'm just trying to tell whether these are said in the second person, you, or in the third person, by the merit of Abraham.
Here it's I conjure you, it's I, right? And it's je, you have the I in the French as well.
Okay.
I'm wondering why the assumption you're making is from the Jewish world being influenced by the Christian world, and why not the reverse?
Okay, that's a great question. I think that one of my assumptions here is that majority culture usually influences minority culture more than minority culture influences majority culture. So I think that would be my basic assumption here. There are many, many Christians. There are very few Jews. And one would assume that the Jews would see the world around them much more than the Christians would see their world. One of the things I've been hoping for many years is to find a reverse example. We can find this among learned men sometimes, that you can see how a Jewish interpretation moves to Christian interpretation, but we can't find this quite as much in practice. So in practice, that's usually my assumption.
Although in religious practice in the church, you have the bread and the wine, which obviously, whether you have kiddush or you have hamotzi or whatever, the bread and wine is clearly influenced the church. Had to.
Okay, so I agree completely. The example I brought from the Mishnah is a great example of that, in which we have this prayer in the Mishnah and Masechet Ta'anit, and then the Christians use these prayers in early Christian prayer. I think Mark Bloch said that the idols of origins are not always such useful idols for us to follow. So I think one of the things that 19th century German Jewish scholars did consistently was that they fought that fight. So for example, if we were to say that, and some of my work just talked about this, that for example, Christian baptism was very important in the Middle Ages. And I could probably give a talk, I did this work many, many years ago about how Jewish circumcision customs were influenced by Christian baptism customs. And then a 19th century German scholar would come and say to me, but Elisheva, Jews did tefillah. Jews immersed before Christians did. So really that's something that Christians took from Jews. As a medievalist who studies the Middle Ages, and as someone who's really interested in not just the diachronic, but also the synchronic happenings in the Middle Ages, I usually tend to look at the time and place where I am. Yes, it's true there are these origins, and I wouldn't argue with you. I agree completely. This came from a shared culture, and we have a shared Judeo-Christian culture. But my assumption is, and maybe I'm wrong, that Jews are usually learning from their surroundings and adopting from their surroundings more than the Christians are, because they are the minority. And maybe that's an assumption that one can question. It is a fairly common assumption in scholarship.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm curious whether your your project focused on ways in which you could learn from the women and the people who do not know.
Okay, so I would say that in the project, I've had probably 17 or 18 students pass through the project over the past 6 years. Really, what's happened is that gender has become a part of the work that everybody does. Rather than having gender be something that one person does or somebody's interested in gender, all of us always consider men and women in everything that we do. So talking about men and women who don't know sometimes is a problem, because if they don't know and they don't write, what can we say about them? But finding their activities, you can then say more about them. So just to give an example, 2 of my students are very, very interested in economy. So going through court records, going through judicial cases, they found the men and the women who are involved, and they can actually count them and tell us what women are doing, what men are doing, and when they're doing it in the same way and when they're doing it differently. So one of my students who's gone through 10,000 cases from Frankfurt, from the court records, can tell you when women are lending to family members, when they're lending to strangers, et cetera, and how that works. So those are the kinds of questions we've been asking and often trying to count, so actually to make them quantitative questions. I'll mention my own work over the past years, the book I wrote during the course of the project. What I wanted to know was, what stories were men and women hearing? What stories were they telling? And in order to make those stories meaningful, I only looked for stories that had to do with practices. In other words, it's not just a story that maybe someone was telling, because if you read a story in a learned man's book, we don't know who was telling the story. But if it's associated with a practice and someone's saying, I'm doing this practice because, then we can say something about it. So my last book was about biblical women and the practices associated with them. And there I can talk about what women were actually doing and how they explained those practices to themselves. So that's maybe another example of that.
Thanks for the great talk, Elisheva. Just since you've asked us to give you thoughts, I guess I'm just throwing a few things out. It occurs to me that the second prayer you showed us, the distance of time, is perhaps important. I mean, if we're convinced that in the first case there's a concern about the ones who do not know making a mistake, in part because of a parallel contemporaneous practice or prayer among Christians, perhaps the distance of time, I think you said the second prayer that you found was a 6th century prayer versus, or from the 7th century, I can't remember. Perhaps I'm misremembering, and you're going to correct me. But it seems like that perhaps gives a different kind of buffer for the rabbi to be deriving something that doesn't seem like it's so much in the immediate environment. And I guess I do wonder a little bit if you know, I feel like you're underplaying potentially the importance of this first case as sort of like a fence for those who are considered like Amei Haaretz versus the rabbi who, in a sense, you know, he gets to make his own authorship and therefore has a kind of authority over the practice versus like whatever these lay people are doing that I don't know about that I can't control.
Okay, so thank you for that comment. 2 things. One, I probably wasn't clear enough, so I will be clear and explain it. The Mass first appears in the 7th century. However, it's copied again and again and again and appears in books of hours, etc., throughout the centuries. So it is a contemporaneous practice, and there are contemporaneous versions. The manuscript I showed you was from the 14th century, so it really is actually contemporaneous to what he's doing. There's a beautiful story in Sefer Hasidim about a Jewish woman whose son is sick, and her Christian neighbor says to her, take this stone and make a potion or medicine for your son with this stone, and your son will be cured. And the Jewish woman says to her neighbor, what is this stone you're giving me? And she says, this stone is a stone from the tomb of Jesus. And it has powers because it comes from the tomb of Jesus. Basically, this stone is a relic. And the Jewish woman in Sefer Hasidim says, I'd rather my son die than use this stone that may cure him. Okay, so Sefer Hasidim, written in the 13th century Germany, has its own moral agenda, and this is why it's saying something in this way. However, I would probably guess that most people would say, if this stone will cure my son, and my son is about to die, who cares where it comes from? And I think that the prayer we found is maybe a nice example of kind of the reverse of that. So here we have a prayer. Let's make it as Jewish as we can. This prayer is not my only example. There's a wonderful example that Gideon Bohak, published a few years ago of a prayer, a conjuration that was said against thieves, so that people won't break into your house and won't steal things from you. It was said to the 3 Magi and all kinds of other things. And the Jews, of course, made it into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they said the same prayer. And the Tosafos talk about this in some of their Shelot and Tshuvot. So we know that there are these prayers going around that people are converting into Jewish things. So I think it's a much more common phenomena than we think, and I think people are using it all the time. I do think it's interesting to ask what the buffer of the rabbi is. In other words, what the rabbi can do here that those people who do not know, the women and the people who do not know, can't do. But here I actually have to apologize because I cut the source, because I didn't want to have to explain the source, for my whole talk instead of doing other things. But Rabbi Paltiel does give one example of a case where it's okay to go and pray by a grave. And the example he gives is that if you wronged a person in his life and you feel bad after he dies, you can go and prostrate yourself on his grave and apologize to him. And that anybody, learned or not learned, can go and do. So I think that once we start having kind of all these cases out there, we realize that it's very, very fuzzy. And I would even be maybe cynical enough to wonder if part of what the rabbi wants here is not the charity money. In other words, instead of having people go on pilgrimages, to that community or that community, let them just give the money and stay at home, and everything will be okay. So I think there are a lot of other things going on in this responsum that don't just have to do with women and men who do not know. But I think we also are seeing, snobism, elitism, what the learned are doing here to those women and people who do not know. And I think that's a really interesting question for further study as well.
Hi, what would Christian reaction have been to the adoption of these practices?
Okay, I think that's a great question. Would they have known, first of all? We don't know. And second of all, I think the question here of the small differences that I responded before is really very interesting. Would they see it as the same or would they see it as different? And I think that's a question I have to ask myself as well. So I'm asking myself critically. In other words, I'm saying to you, my audience tonight, or when I'm writing about this, look how similar this is. But maybe a medieval person would have said, it's so different. How can you say it's the same, right? So that's part of what I'm trying to get at. When can we say it's so similar? And when can we say, oh, it's so different because it's not Jesus and Mary and, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that's so Jewish, so it's really ours. And I think we can see the medieval people also grappling with that, and that's what I think we see in this responsum. So I don't know what the Christians would have said, and I don't know if they would have cared. And maybe they would have said to the Jews, you see, you're using our prayers, come on over, come be part of us as well. So a lot of different responses could have been possible here.
Thank you, Elisheva. That was incredible. So much stuff. My question, I suppose, I apologize for its bad formulation. It's about repetition and the importance of repetition of prayer. And partly it's because of this slide has been up for a few minutes, and I was thinking about this. I conjure you by all the prayers that exist and have ever existed, which sort of conveniently incorporates every prayer that ever happened into this one moment. But I suppose what I'm sort of asking about is so much importance gets attached in both prayers to the idea that there have been prayers before, different prayers, but also the same prayer. And so I'm wondering how that repetition of prayer factors in some ways to this borrowing from perhaps sort of a sister system of prayers. And then I almost wonder whether this, I conjure by all the prayers that exist, includes the Christian prayers, which conveniently are now made to solve the Jewish person's fever.
Okay, so first of all, it's a beautiful question. I think that one of the things that you're touching on that to me is very important is the importance of prayer in the medieval world and the importance of praying. Recently, I went with my students in Jerusalem. We went to Latrun, to what's known as the Minzar HaShatkanim, the Trappist monastery, where people don't speak so that they can pray, right? And I think that I felt very medieval when I was there. They actually pray in French, not in Latin, but we felt very much at home listening to them pray the Psalms, which we did for the whole morning. We heard them singing the Psalms back and forth to each other. And it made me think a lot about the importance of prayer and of speaking the prayers. And that brought me to the medieval Jewish texts, in which we have an explosion of prayer. Think of all the piyutim that are written in the Middle Ages. I'm not sure the Ashkenazic paitanim are the best writers of piyutim in the world. And I think that their Spanish contemporaries probably would have had a lot to say about the piyutim that they wrote, but they certainly enjoyed writing those piyutim, and they enjoyed saying them. And when you look at medieval machzorim, which is opposed to sidurim, we have tons of, because who could remember all those words by heart? So you have to have them written down to pray from. So when we look at medieval machzorim and you see this kind of explosion of prayer, and then you read the custom books, and in the custom books, we have the Amcha, the women and the people who do not know, insisting on saying this piyutim, and the rabbi is trying to slack off and being brought back in and said, no, you stay when they're saying all these piyutim, and that's what the Sifrei Minhagim talk about. That's what the custom books talk about. It's not that the learned people wanted to say all these prayers, and the simple, so-called simple people didn't want to say them. It's that the rabbis really would have liked to go learn or do something else. And the people were saying, we want to say these piyutim. Stay with us here when we're saying these piyutim. That's what comes out of the custom books. So I think you're onto something, all the prayers that were said and how effective they can be. And I think that's probably part of what Isaac is doing here when he writes this down. And he writes down lots of other prayers as well. So I think that's something to think about. So thank you for that comment.
You know, what if would it be all right if we took a series of comments that you respond to? Do you need a pencil?
I have.
Okay, so please go ahead and then I'll come to those.
Thank you. So, do we know anything about Jewish pilgrimage in the High Middle Ages to places of burial of revered figures in Ashkenaz?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elisheva. It's a wonderful talk. It has made me think about a number of things and questions that are still in my mind, which you can probably answer. Somewhat larger questions than the immediate texts. Number one, these parallels between the Christian and the Jewish prayers that are so striking in many instances. What does this suggest to you in terms of the community or communities? To what degree were Jews privy to or interested in Christian prayers? You're certainly right that it's much more likely that the majority culture is is the superior one in terms of that. They are doing the influencing rather than the other way around. But I worry a little bit about that because it tends to subordinate what the Jews are doing, because they are not just copying, they are appropriating. It's a creative act of their own rather than a simple adoption and adaptation. And so I wonder whether you might want to nuance this notion of the relationship between the majority and the minority culture.
Thank you, Eric. We have Maury and then Nicholas. Did you have a comment?
Hi, I'm just curious about the transmission and the circulation of these prayers. You mentioned sort of the idea of the Jews sort of hearing their Christian neighbors saying them, and I don't know how literal you meant by hear, but I am curious that if people are hearing them orally and then perhaps formulating their own versions, you would end up having hundreds of different versions of these prayers. And so I'm curious about if we know the process of how they became semi-standardized and written down, and if we think that the rabbis who transcribed them may have edited them, added those clarifications into it.
Thank you. One last question, Elisheva? Please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk, Elisheva. My question is about I'm curious about the context of the statement, the critical statement. You have women and men who do not know. I mean, is that a general concern? Are there other practices that fall under this category? And I think it also has to do with Eric's question of community forming, because you can see in the Christian context in these centuries also a concern about the unlearned and how the unlearned pray, etc. And you see a kind of a control that is being exercised there. So, yeah, is there like a general context of vernacularization that is happening, maybe, or how do you see that?
Okay, so many questions. So I'll try. Pilgrimage to graves. So my colleague Lucia Raspe has done beautiful work on the cemetery in Worms, And she's shown there how there was like the Valley of the Rabbis that people would go to, where all the rabbis were buried, and they would go on pilgrimage there. But that pilgrimage could also be the people in the city of Worms who would go there, on Erev Rosh Chodesh or whatever it was. It's Rosh Chodesh today, so Chodesh Tov to everybody. But they would go there on Rosh Chodesh, and they would pray there, or they would go there on Tisha B'Av, and they would pray there by those rabbis. That's one way of thinking of pilgrimage. We also have, in my postdoc, who is now a scholar in his own right, Dr. Andreas Lennart, showed me a beautiful, beautiful passage at the end of a manuscript in which somebody writes and he says, I went to this cemetery because my mother is buried there, and I went to this cemetery because my father is buried there, and I went to this cemetery because my great aunt is buried there. And he kind of has like a mental map of where all his ancestors are buried, and he's going from place to place and kind of going on pilgrimage to these places. We have a lot of different patterns of how people could go to the cemetery. But I think that the most important thing I want to say is that this was a regular practice. People went to the cemetery all the time. And they would have taken a special vow to go to the grave of an important rabbi or of an important family member. And I'm not sure I can distinguish between them based on the sources I have. But this is going on all the time. So I think that would be where I would stand on that. The question that Professor Gruen asked, I think that we have a lot of parallels. And the question of what does this mean in terms of community, I agree, it's appropriating. I wrote a whole article about how they're appropriating it. They're not just doing what the Christians do, but they're doing it with a twist. They're doing it with a way that makes it Jewish. They're doing it by bringing a pasuk, an idea, an interpretation that makes this into something that's Jewish. And I think that's how they would justify doing the same thing, because it's actually not the same thing at all, because they're calling on their own examples. I think the interesting question is, when do they decide to appropriate? And what makes something worthy of appropriation, and when they decide that it's not the right thing to do. And a good example that I've worked on in the past is fasting on Fridays. Fasting on Fridays, and medieval Jews fasted a lot, is very Christian. So Jews would do almost anything they could not to fast on a Friday. And this included when a fast actually fell on a Friday and they were supposed to fast on that Friday. What would they do to make it clear that they weren't fasting on Friday? So I think, questions like that, when does it become so glaring to them that they can't do the same thing and they actually are willing to change? Or I've seen it that it has to do with certain clothes that people wear. What to me still stays very problematic, and perhaps that was what I was trying to articulate tonight, maybe I did not do it clearly enough, is that I don't know what the mechanism is. In other words, I can't find a clear-cut mechanism, and I've been searching for that clear-cut mechanism for many, many years in different ways. So that's the question that I'm really left with. How do these communities communicate with each other? We have to understand that Jews were in Christian homes and Christians were in Jewish homes all the time. The space was not as separate as we would imagine. This is true even in early modern Europe. My colleague Deborah Kaplan has showed this beautifully in the case of Strasbourg, that even in Strasbourg, where Jews weren't supposed to be in Strasbourg, and they had to leave every night at 10 o'clock, and that's why the bells rang in the cathedrals, they still were there during the day. So even this space that was supposed to be not a space for Jews had Jews in it. So spaces are really shared. And then the question is, how do they distinguish themselves in other ways? So by what they wear, by what they eat, by the times they do things. Jews eat fish on Shabbat. Christians eat fish on Fridays. I mean, we have a lot of really interesting examples that are very small examples, and I think they're seeing each other all the time. And these small differences, like the earrings Jewish women wear, like other small signs that show you who's Jewish and who's Christian, become very, very important. I think that for me, traveling back to the past from the 21st century, I'm often missing seeing those things that a Jew in the Middle Ages would have seen right away. And I'll just give you one example because it's one of my favorite examples. But Jews bought their clothes from Christians. Christians often sewed the clothes with threads that shouldn't be mixed according to biblical prohibitions, shatnez, we would say. What would Jews do? And we know this from a number of sources. They would take the clothes they bought, they would bring them to a tailor, ask the tailor to unstitch all the unkosher stitchings and stitch it back up. What does that mean? That means if I met a Christian or a Jew on the street, wearing Christian clothes, they were all wearing the same clothes, but if I was Jewish, maybe I could notice the threads. It would almost be an invisible or kind of an almost invisible way of saying I'm Jewish to somebody who was Jewish and knew how to look, but somebody who didn't know wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So I'm looking for those mechanisms that were so obvious to Jews at that time, but which, looking at it from a distance, we wouldn't know. I'll just give you a crazy example, but a few weeks ago, my husband and I were in Vietnam. We were sitting in a hotel on Shabbat morning. I was wearing a bandana, and my husband had a baseball cap on. Basically, I was covering my head like I always cover my hair, and my husband was not wearing his kippah, so he was wearing a baseball cap. We were sitting eating breakfast, and two people walked over to us, and they said, Shabbat Shalom. And we looked at them. We were eating our breakfast very happily, and we weren't talking to anybody. We said, how did you know? And they said, a guy sitting with a baseball cap and a woman sitting with a bandana, what else could you be? So, and of course, we weren't eating the food. We were eating like hard-boiled eggs and cereal and other things like that. So I think there are all these signals that medieval Jews would have seen all the time that I, as a historian, am searching for, but I'm not quite sure how to find them. And then the question is, what do we do with these signals? Okay. So I hope that starts to answer that, but I'm not quite sure where to go from that historically, which is what I'm really searching for in my research. Transmission, hundreds of versions. What do we do? How do we standardize these things? I think that a lot of these things weren't standardized in the medieval period. I think they were standardized later, and they were copied from person to person. I really like this example here, which is why I'm going back to it. This Christian calendar in Hebrew writing. You probably can't see from where you are, but it starts there at the top where it says, Elu chodshei hagoyim v'shikutzehem. These are the months of the non-Jews and their abominations, I guess I would translate it. The word shikutzehem is blacked out, because the censor blacked that out in the 16th century. And then it goes on. Where did the Jews get this list from? Even of Christian saints' days. So part of it is oral and part of it is written. And part of it they copy and part of it they write down. And I think what we see over time is how this is standardized, but a lot of it isn't standardized till print. So a lot of it is only standardized when print comes along, and we only see this in 16th and 17th and 18th century books. And therefore you can find these differences. One of the songs I've worked on over recent years is a wedding song in which the Chatan and Kala are blessed, like Adam and Chava, Sarah and Abraham, Yitzhak and Rivka. But we also have Tzipora and Moshe, Esther and Mordechai. And if you compare the different manuscripts, you can see that each manuscript has different couples. And that's part of the lack of standardization that we have until early modern times. So that's part of where I'd go, but I haven't actually checked that. So that's kind of just off the cuff. And the last question about women and men who do not know, another expression we have in the text is ha'am shebasadot, the people in the field. And sometimes rabbinic responses say, the people in the field, they don't know the difference, and they do this. And we have no way to teach them, so we'll just go along with them, right? So from that point of view, we have different expressions that kind of portray this somewhat lack of respect towards these people. In 13th century France, we know that a lot of Jews were praying in French, especially women were praying in French. In Germany, the Jews do not pray in medieval German. They pray only in Hebrew. But I think one of the things that we do see within the Jewish communities is that most Jews know how to pray in Hebrew. They know the Hebrew letters. That's how women know Yiddish later on, because they know the Hebrew letters. So I think that's part of the way they try to stay away from this kind of mass culture by making everybody know these Hebrew letters and being able to say the prayers in Hebrew. I don't want to make all the Jews in the community into learned, but I don't want to make them as unlearned as some people have made them. And I think that if a Jew could recite this prayer that we saw here and read it, male or female, they know something, and they know these stories, and they have this world of culture, but they still are women and people who do not know if they don't know they're supposed to be praying to a place and not praying to people. So I'm not quite sure what that distinction is, and sometimes I think that the rabbis and these people are very close to each other, and sometimes I think there's a huge gap between them, and it really depends on the matter I'm working on. So I'm not quite sure how to take that with a definitive answer. I hope I've answered everything.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Baumgarten. Have a wonderful evening.